We're now ready for our first panel. So if I'd like Ted and the panelists are making their way up to the stage.
Thank you all for attending today. As noted, I'm the strategy and research manager here at GNSI, so I oversee a lot of our events, so it's beautiful to see the room full. And we're happy to welcome so many guests from around the world, including a contingent of guests from Poland and Europe. Obviously, people are very interested in seeing what type of lessons we can take from this conflict and how do we ensure when peace does come, it is a lasting peace. As we look at our panel today, this panel number one, it's the strategic lessons learned from the war. It's the big picture. We're starting with the big picture look at what can we learn from this conflict over the last 3 years. And really what we can learn from the conflict over the last 9 years. Obviously, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and there was a simmering conflict in the Donbass from 2014 until 2022, when the often called full-scale invasion commenced. But the conflict still raged during 2014 to 2022. There was still combat deaths, and there was still issues and agreements that were made and broken, and the lines shifted. So the conflict, again, although we'll focus a lot on the last 3 years, there's still many lessons to be learned from the preceding 5 years prior to that. So some of the things we'll look at today as we look at those strategic, again, big picture lessons learned is deterrence. So how first do you stop such a conflict from starting? We can also look at logistics. We'll look at munition stocks. Obviously, the huge implication of drones and UAVs. And then we'll look at some of the other contingent effects of the conflict, including China, propaganda, disinformation, mobilizations across Ukraine and Russia. How are they able to get the manpower to form their forces, as well as the irregular warfare? And that's why we've gathered this panel here today. David Kramer was supposed to join us, but unfortunately he fell ill, so it will just be the three of us tackling all these issues and your questions, but we're amply prepared. So today we have on our first panel, we have Maria Snegovaya and Christopher Marsh. Chris is serves as the chair of the Joint Special Operations Masters of Arts program at the National Defense University, and his full bio is on our website as well as the app that you have in front of you. And Maria is the senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And again, her full bio is on the app and on the website. So why don't we turn it over to Maria and get us started on your opening statement, please.
Thank you. So since we're lacking one more participant, maybe I can use a little bit more time.
But of course.
Awesome. So certainly right now, as we speak, we find ourselves in a very interesting moment when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine. It's been lasting for 3 years. And while I would, and this is essentially going to be the point of my presentation, Ukraine has been able to achieve substantive major milestones on the battlefield. Right now, clearly, we are seeing a very serious turnaround of the position of the U.S. administration vis-a-vis this war, which definitely will result in some radical changes going forward. But let me first talk as to where we find ourselves 3 years into this war, the largest war in Europe after the end of the Second World War, which definitely has a lot of strategic implications internationally and for Russia and Ukraine, as well as the United States in particular, before we get to long-term consequences of the current changes in the U.S. posture. So first of all, the new administration run by President Trump and its members have often made the point that Ukraine has no cards. More recently, he made similar statements to President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is in a very weak position. There is no way to negotiate with no cards. But I, in this presentation, gonna challenge that claim by saying that actually Ukraine has a number of cards at its disposal, as the last few years have demonstrated. First of all, in late February 2022, Ukraine found itself opposing the allegedly second largest army in the world, having been invaded by Russia. In terms of population size, economic resources, weapon stockpiles, Russia on paper significantly surpasses Ukraine. And yet, 3 years into this war, Russia has been able to certainly advance into Ukraine, but at tremendous cost. Russia is losing about 30 men to occupy 1 kilometer in Ukraine, and it's actually It actually has been moving at the rate of about 3.3 kilometers per month or 40 kilometers per year. At this rate, as somebody has said, it will take Russia 80 years to occupy all of Ukraine. That, however, may not necessarily be Putin's ultimate goals. His minimalist goals are at least occupying Donetsk and Luhansk regions. He is nowhere there at this pace still. It will take quite some time. His maximalist goals may still be unchanged, as he is hoping to still perhaps implement some sort of political takeover over Ukraine, destabilize the government, run the elections, replace Zelensky with more maybe agreeable pro-Kremlin personality, again, remain very unlikely. Despite the fact that Russia has been getting assistance from the so-called countries of the axis of upheaval, China, North Korea, and Iran, when it comes to the munition, the drones, missiles, and so on, Russia domestically has been reaching capacity and appears unable to significantly boost its military-industrial base. I'll cite the report by Carnegie Endowment that appeared in December 2024 that says the industry, including the military industry, has hit a ceiling in terms of both production capacity, which is 81% loaded, labor resources, 73% of enterprises complaining about a shortage of personnel, the economy almost at full employment at 2.3%. The unemployment rate low, labor shortages particularly pronounced, and the inflation is accelerating despite the Central Bank of Russia keeping the keynote at that precedented high 21%. The growth that Russia has been able to maintain over the last 2 years through unprecedented influx of the state investment is also slowing down. It's been about 3-4% in the last 2 years officially. Now it's slowing down to 1% in the coming 2 years. And the rainy funds are being depleted. Even trade with China is not growing as fast as it did. It seems that China has been able to substitute for some of the goods that have been sanctioned by the West, but there isn't a lot of ways to expand further. So we are more or less confident that despite the fact that Russia is working at full capacity in order to push forward in Ukraine, it's still unable to. And Ukraine is very successfully containing Russia on the ground. We also have the statistic like half as many tanks are left in storage of Russia by the end of 2024 as compared to how many there were at the beginning of the war. Altogether, it's definitely a good, I think this evidence definitely makes us say that Ukraine has been able to achieve tremendous achievements. It's preserved its sovereignty, survived as an independent state, also has been able to deplete and contain Russia. And at this rate, Russia has no ability to radically alter the situation on the ground. Unless, and this is the major variable, Ukraine loses the supply of the Western aid. Clearly, yesterday's suspension of the U.S. aid is going to translate into the frontline situation, albeit not instantly. At the moment, the way the war is being fought, most of the casualties are being inflicted on the Russian troops through the Ukraine-produced types of weapons and equipment, mines and drones in particular, plus some traditional artillery fires that inflicting major losses on the Russian army. However, if this situation with the paused aid will continue, by mid-2025, we will see some radical alteration of the ground. And however, not everything is lost for Ukraine. Europe can step in and specifically by accelerating the purchases of the aid from the United States, hopefully we'll be able to substitute whatever is going to be lost on the side of Ukraine. Altogether, Ukraine is not losing. There is a very good possibility for Ukraine to sustain the stalemate and continuously limit Russia's advances further, at the same time hopefully reducing the threat that Russia represents to Europe and the international order as we know it. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for those initial comments. And Chris, you can take us a little different direction, right? You can look at a couple irregular warfare, a few other things.
I have 3 main points that I'm going to speak about, but first I'd like to give my disclaimer. As a member of the Department of Defense, I do not speak on behalf of the department nor the Trump administration. These comments are my own and my own reflections. Sorry, I had to get that out of the way. Yesterday, it was announced that the U.S. is suspending weapon shipments to Ukraine, and this is likely fallout from Friday's horrific meeting between President Zelensky and Trump and Vice President Vance. The latest move only highlights a strategic lesson that I've made long ago, long before the White House-Zelensky fallout, and that is the U.S. does not have the appetite for another long-term, drawn-out engagement overseas at this point in time. Many in the U.S., from the military, citizens, political leadership, they just don't see the point in it. To quote an anonymous general officer from several years ago, from 2014, during the summer, he said, "I'm not going to send U.S. troops in to keep Russian-speaking people in Ukraine from being joined back to Russia." Now, we can argue and fight that position and talk about the costs involved and what is the actual wish of the people on the ground. But the fact is, it is a position that is increasingly held in the U.S. population and within the Department of Defense, that they wanted to allow this to go on and not send U.S. boots on the ground. So unlike the global war on terror with an attack on the homeland and threats of weapons of mass destruction, the Russia-Ukraine war is a hard sell for much of the American population, war fighters, and the leadership. While some saw a line in the sand that had been crossed and a democratic regime that was standing up to a revisionist Russia, others saw things differently, as I just mentioned a moment ago. Many said it was not our war. I'm actually surprised it kept U.S. interests as long as it did, and that we saw the types of weapon systems transferred that we did, including Javelins, ATACMS, MLRS, Abrams tanks, other tanks, Stryker armored personnel carriers, Bradley fighting vehicles, UAS of all varieties, etc., along with training of infantry units, incidentally over 150,000 troops trained, all the way to fighter pilots. That's a lot of training, it's a lot of equipment, a lot of materiel that was transferred, and this was used to hold back Russia from its expansive, unprovoked war against Ukraine. The second strategic lesson is one I have long espoused and have put in my writings over the years, and that is that Russia doesn't negotiate with general intentions for peace, but to take an operational pause or exercise strategic patience, during which they rearm, recruit, and train. The only question then is, what will the next move be? To take more of Ukraine, the Baltics, or Transnistria? To which the answer might be yes. The third strategic lesson is that we do not live in a bubble, and China is watching this war closely, and they are drawing lessons, strategic lessons, for its own quote-unquote reunification, which is not a reunification, plans for Taiwan and its island-building aspirations and territorial ambitions in the South China Sea. Returning to our first lesson, that the U.S. does not have the appetite for another GWOT, this worries Taiwan, as it should, as it only serves to embolden the People's Republic of China, something we've seen heating up with recent live-fire exercises off the Taiwanese coast and bellicose statements coming from Beijing. That'll serve as my opening comments, and I'm happy to address a variety of questions during the Q&A.
Sure. So one of the other points that we discussed, going back to the beginning of the war, like you mentioned, Maria. So how did the Russian leadership and obviously President Putin feel like they could actually invade Ukraine? One, with the number of forces that they had, which was relatively small compared for the size of the operation, the population of Ukraine, as well as the amount of land they'd have to occupy. And also that the Ukrainians would not resist as furiously. Was that a miscalculation, or what made them feel that they could in a sense get away with it?
Well, Russian leadership is not particularly known for being very good at adjusting their priors, right? You'll notice that they have stuck to the ultimate goals no matter what. 2014, they tried more or less the same thing in 2022, despite the resistance that they already received in Ukraine back in 2014 to their regional aggression. Basically, they expected that they will be welcomed with flowers in Ukraine. Remember that some of their early troops brought with them the celebratory parade uniform, and also actually the Rose Guards as part of the army who were expected to take care of the local population. They expected to be welcome in Ukraine and not having to fight. And the same actually applies to the current situation. They have adjusted the tactics, but the ultimate goals remain the same. That's just the nature of how they plan. And the expectation is that they definitely did not expect what's going to happen in 2022. But looking at the military analysis that they issue, looking at the think tanks analysis, like research centers that publish, and Putin's own claims, the ultimate goals remains the same, even if it now requires much more doubling down on the effort. Now, the main moving variable in this whole analysis is the Western support. And just as Soviet nomenclature, the Soviet elites, something that I study in details, the Russian leadership always remained convinced that the Western unity surrounding Ukraine is not going to last, and that the West has a very short-term planning horizon, unlike Putin, who stays in power forever. And so Western leaders come and go, and eventually the tide will shift. Much of the resistance of Ukraine is sustained through Western support. So they're not really fighting Ukraine as the narrative goes, as the original plan. They're actually fighting an entire West. And once the West sort of flips, sort of something that we're already seeing, the Ukraine will be given, essentially abandoned and left to Putin's or the Kremlin to take advantage of. Unfortunately, in a way, what's going on right now seems to probably reconfirm Putin's priors. So they certainly feel excited, and things, based on the reporting that is coming from Russia, from Moscow, they are almost like things are too good to be true for them a little bit. So they're like trying to be sort of moderate the expectations, the excitement about what's going to happen. But certainly a lot of the developments were right now happening in the West are exactly as it's been predicted by Putin, that eventually the support will stop and Ukraine will basically be left to Russia to take control.
Chris, your thought?
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Maria said, if not everything. I would just add a few points. I think he was acting, Putin, off of flawed assumptions. He thought it would be a Crimea 2.0, something he could go in and do rather quickly, take Hostomel Airport, bring in the VDV, the airborne units, and use their SOF and Spetsnaz and occupy the country, occupy Kyiv in 3 days, occupy the country in 3 weeks. That was wrong. Western support, as Maria pointed out, was a huge denominator that changed things, but that's not what initially led to the turn. It was Zelensky as a leader who, when asked, when we did exactly what Putin anticipated, which was try to exfil the president, Zelensky, he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. And so we fell into that kind of trap as the West initially, and it was Zelensky who said, no, we're going to stay in and fight. And he did. And he continues that fight now to today. And the question is, as Maria brought up during her introductory comments, how long can this fight go on without Western aid? And European aid is probably forthcoming, but will it be sufficient? And how much? But Russia, for its part, is low on stockpiles as well, personnel, and so it's very hard to predict. It's up to these leaders. But I to echo my second point from the introductory comments, and Zelensky was trying to make this point to Vice President Vance. You can't really negotiate with Putin. He takes the opportunity to take time, operational pause, if you will, but he's not doing that with the genuine intention of reaching a peace agreement, but with pausing, rearming, Same thing happened after 2014 to 2022. There were, as you mentioned, there's operations in the Donbass. Unconventional warfare was going on, irregular warfare in general. And in the end, it was all a prelude to a large-scale land invasion. So I'll stop there.
Sure. So what we're hearing is that, as often happens with aggressors when they start a war, they have what's called in the literature imperfect information. It's reality versus expectations. And that imperfect information can be from a number of reasons. One might be they're in an echo chamber. Their underlings are only giving the leader who's going to make the decision the information they want to hear. Another one is they simply just don't have the information. They don't know how to predict the other actors' actions. Or their intelligence services and military services are not capable of gaining the knowledge that would allow for proper decision making. And what you end up having is a suboptimal foreign policy, which includes a war where you're thinking it's going to go one way and it goes the opposite way. And we see this again in a lot of conflicts throughout history, where again, the leader who decides to go to war, if they knew how it was going to play out and they knew just a little bit more information, they might change their actions or not invade at all. So what we see is some possible lessons here, and I'll turn it back to you to discuss this a little bit more in depth, is as we look at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, some possible lessons is what were the signals that Putin was receiving from the West and the determination from the West, as well as the Ukrainians, and what made him and his decision makers, for the limited information they might have been receiving, think that they were not going to meet a stiff resistance, and that the West would not provide the aid at the speed that it did, as well as the amount that it did. And we can see that likely Putin did not calculate that. And then one last point, I think, as you look at the possible goals of the initial incursion, Putin and the Russians called it a special military operation. They really avoid calling it a war. And that would lend itself to think that they were looking at a limited operation, go in, topple the government, likely occupy part of the country, not the whole part of the country. So I don't think that was part of the goal, was to take all of Ukraine, particularly, again, on just the simple troop count. They just didn't have the troops to do so. So that was some indications there. But looking at that imperfect information piece, what could the West have done? And if we look at the lead up to the war, in 2021, in the spring, right after the Biden administration comes in, Russia builds up on the Ukraine border. There's a lot of roughly over 100,000 troops build up. There's a lot of concern and consternation in Ukraine and the West. There's protests. There's, again, what are you doing, Putin? This type of thing. But there's no hard line. There's no sanctions. There was no buildup in the West of that buildup in the spring and April of 2021. And I think the Russians took a little bit of a lesson from that. Like, okay, they're not going to do too much. Putin publishes his famous article in the summer of 21 saying Ukrainians are Russians, pretty much hinting at, hey, we're going to eventually reacquire part of this territory. And then in the next buildup in the winter of 2021 into 2022, you see the West is pretty much saying, we're going to sanction you if you invade. That's the signal that the Russian policymakers are getting. And sanctions don't deter wars. And that's part of this conversation, or that information the decision makers tend to make decisions off of. Sanctions often don't deter wars if they're as dedicated as we have seen in the past. Maria?
Brings us to the broader question, to the extent Putin is deterrable altogether. I think the West has a tendency to always sort of assign itself the agency, like with NATO expansion having provoked Putin, where a lot of the real internal drivers have to do with the backgrounds of who the elites are, domestic considerations, and the general perception of the environment that may be highly biased, conditioned by their socialization and their backgrounds, rather than anything that we do. And the problem is that I do believe that in the 2021, the signaling on the side of the US administration was relatively strong, especially at the end. There were different approaches tried. You cannot argue that one did not try to negotiate with Putin. In fact, a lot of such initiatives were coming from the European leaders and the US, but on all of the occasions, especially later by like December and January, it was clear that the Russian side was unwilling to negotiate, and these offers that they were making, like for NATO to withdraw to the 1997 borders, were completely unacceptable. I think that the sanctions were threatened, but Putin didn't take this seriously. And honestly, he had a point, because ultimately, despite all the sanctions that were unleashed, we see that they were still able to rebuild, reconstitute, even if they have been contained, I would argue, for the reasons that I explained, right? They are unable to really radically alter the situation on the ground, despite the fact that they are actually fighting against Ukraine. With all due respect, right, not about against the United States or even NATO altogether. So to the extent to which Putin was deterrable in the first place, I think it's a big question. Because of his existing misguided beliefs, I think he wasn't really deterrable. What did work well was the US government decision to leak a lot of the information, to declassify it, and something that should be learned probably as one of the main lessons as to, if not deter the war, at least prepare the allies as to what was coming. And I think that eliminated the opportunity for Putin to use the false flag operation. And basically, at the beginning of the war, Putin completely lost information war, unlike 2008 and to some extent even 2014. So that is something to learn and probably to apply going forward. But in broader sense, it takes us to the question of Putin's rationality. Is he rational? He is probably within his worldview, right? In the way he sees the world, as like the Cold War outcomes being quite unfair to Russia, or what he's doing makes some weird sense from his perspective in terms of Russian national interest, even if he is de facto destroying Russia's future as we speak. That takes us again to the broader issue of what are national security interests? Are they really as fixed as we believe them to be? And the answer is probably not really. Much of that seems to be conditioned by the leadership's biases and perception of the reality that not necessarily always factually correct. In Putin's defense, though, I will argue that the US and the Western intel altogether did anticipate a very quick ending to the war, precisely based on pure material comparisons between the two countries. Indeed, remember the forecast that Kyiv will be taken within several days and Ukraine will be occupied within several weeks. So it wasn't just Putin who was misguided.
In terms of the sanctions, I agree. Sanctions don't deter wars. And that's what we initially came with, was we will sanction you with sanctions like you've never seen before, right? And Putin thought this would be a short war. He had reasons to believe, based on flawed intelligence, based on living in a bubble and all the factors that you mentioned, and he was being surrounded by yes men, that he could do this. And you mentioned that he maybe didn't have the ambition to take all of Ukraine. I think, if I heard you correctly, I disagree. I think he did think if he could take Kyiv, he could take all of Ukraine eventually through the political apparatus, especially if he could put into power, as he did with Sergei Aksyonov in Crimea, if he could put someone into position of power in Kyiv, then that person would be able to hold Ukraine together. In addition, he tried to take other cities like Odessa, which would have made Ukraine landlocked with all the territories of Novorossiya over through Odessa towards Transnistria, which, thanks to Alexander Lukashenko, who did a live television broadcast and showed us what the actual military phases were that they were planning, as he stood in front of a map with the phases and showed how he was involved. And we got to see, oh, okay, Transnistria is in this game. And I think it still is, but it'll be down the road because they're held back with the attempt to take the rest of the oblasts that they're trying to occupy. And as Maria said, fighting tooth and nail for just kilometers and paying a heavy price for that. I'd also add that what we think of as what a victory would look like is not what Putin thinks of as a victory. I believe in late February of 2022, when Dmitry Peskov came on TV and said, we're meeting all of our political objectives, and they focused more on the southeast, on the Novorossiya region, as is being called again, that they were readjusting their strategic goals, and no longer did they try to have an ambition of occupying all of Ukraine, but just those territories that were they felt friendlier to Russian occupation. And of course they weren't. And Mariupol stood hard, and Kharkiv has stood hard as well, and Odessa never took off. So these misfortunes for Putin, if you will, have been victories for Ukraine, and I'll leave it at that.
So we're hearing that at the beginning of the war, there's some miscalculations, obviously, by the aggressor. These sanctions, maybe they could have deterred or not. That's more a realist point of view. And then we hear an idea of, okay, what's the actual personality and the culture? Are they just aggressive in nature? So I have a kind of a two-parter question to look at is Putin more of a strategist or an opportunist? Did you just see an opportunity of a possible weakened West or a non-really in-the-game West in the 2021-2022 timeframe? And then from that, what do we go now looking at future conflicts in this vein of deterrence? How do we ensure that there's no other major large-scale conventional conflict, whether we're talking with China and Taiwan or somewhere else in Europe or possibly even in the Middle East? So now we've kind of run this thread through this case study of the Russia-Ukraine war. What's that mean for the future? So we'll first talk Putin. Is he more of a strategist or an opportunist? And then what would that mean for leaders of other powers that might end up starting a conventional conflict like this? Again, noting that this conflict's different than the war on terror or other occupations we might have seen because of the scale.
I will say that I actually work a lot right now on the Soviet/Russian continuity of beliefs, meaning that a lot of what we're seeing today Putin is doing cannot be really understood without putting it in the context of the Soviet thinking about the world. For example, the staunch anti-Westernism or the claim over the post-Soviet space, like this imperialist claim, especially the countries that formerly made up the part of the Soviet Union, or this Russian, again, neo-imperial self-perception. That is because, in my view, these elites have not really changed that much from the Soviet times. Many of them are Soviet nomenclatura of the lower ranks, plus middle lower ranks, plus FSB/KGB. So it's this power vertical of the nomenclatura and security services with very hawkish anti-Western beliefs. Accordingly, this is not about Putin only, first of all. It's about power vertical in Russia that has never fully democratized, never really altered. In the 1990s, what we have seen has been the weakening of the power vertical of the federal center, but the elites largely remain the same, and for the same reasons. There is no civil society in Russia. I think it's pretty obvious at this point. What we perceived as a victory of the West was in reality just a weakening of the Soviet Union/Russia, which then resurrected, rebuilt, and re-attacked. So it's not Cold War, even Cold War 2.0. It's the same Cold War very much, just with a brief intermission in the 1990s and 2000s. From that perspective, in my opinion, Putin is an ideologically driven man. So he may be a tactical opportunist, which I think we've seen on a number of occasions, but the goals are more or less the same, consistent. I mentioned that they do not really alter even the goals vis-a-vis Ukraine. And the same war that he's fighting should be understood in the broader, much more ambitious goals of taking over the West, or at least demonstrating the weakness of NATO, that the West is a paper tiger, and the futility of essentially the arrangement of the unipolar world. Now, the future, the question about the future, where this is all going, and what sort of lessons do we draw? Well, one thing, right, that's new about that the war made sort of apparent is the building axis of upheaval, the alliance. There's a lot of debate as you can call it an alliance, but certainly a certain alignment between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. At least North Korea, Iran, and Russia, the pariah states of the current world, plus China. And certainly extremely dangerous development. Russia also tries to sort of come up with an alternative economy where the Western rules no longer apply, where you can circumvent sanctions and other restrictions all you want, basically challenging the Western hegemony as it sees it. something very dangerous, something that, again, we did not anticipate to happen to the extent that it actually took place, especially with North Korean troops being deployed in this war. And accordingly, something definitely to watch for going forward, especially in keeping in sight that the Chinese aggression against Taiwan is getting likely day by day. And we are very likely to face two-front war with Russia attacking the European security and also China going after Taiwan. The West is also very obviously divided. If anything, there was short-term unity ahead of the war, but now in front of the war. But now we're seeing that these divisions are getting much more pronounced, and it's very clear Russia, in that sense, is setting the way forward for other potential aggressors, enemies of the West. That the best way forward is to divide the West. Even military readiness means less than empowering the actors who will just undermine this unity and support. And I think so far there are reasons to believe for many actors within this axis of upheaval that they have history on their side.
Okay. Chris?
It's hard to keep up with Maria.
Yes, yes.
She's firing off a lot of good facts and ideas. One thing she said, though, that I think I disagree with, and the premise of my book, The Putin Playbook, which is coming out this fall, is a little plug.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Is that Putin came in at a time when there were opportunities, and the 90s were a time of opportunities, and we mishandled it. And I think if we sort of shamed Russia in its loss of the Cold War, and the Yeltsin administration didn't do much to improve the situation in Russia in terms of democracy, especially with the 96 presidential elections, when he was prepared to walk away, to change the result if he hadn't won. But I believe in looking at Putin that there's been an evolution in his thinking, and major milestones in that evolution were the 2003 advancement of NATO into the Baltic regions, the Baltic republics, independent states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And by 2007, the Munich Security Conference speech, where he comes out and chastises the world, really, about America's hypersonic use of force, and asks who likes this, who wants this, who wants the United States involved in this way. And that's a big difference from 2001, when after 9/11, Putin was calling President George W. Bush and telling him, we understand we're fighting counter-terrorist operations ourselves. We sympathize with you. And I think there was a gradual evolution of his thinking, and it was an opportunity lost. Getting back to the strategist or opportunist, I wrote in a strategic multi-layer assessment back in 2020 that Putin was a pragmatist. And I think that fits in nicely with the opportunist idea, when he looks for the international system for opportunities to avail themselves. And when they do, he decides whether or not it's the right time to act. And he certainly did that with Crimea in 2014. And then after that was successful and the West did very little other than sanction, did not get involved other than military training and so forth, which both of us were involved in, me with the MOTA program, you through your military service. We helped stand up a Ukrainian force that was more capable, I believe, and had a better understanding of operations and strategy. Though they certainly had good understanding, but it was based in the Soviet thinking. And we tried to help them come to a Western approach, thinking in terms of the gray zone and conflicts below the threshold of armed conflict and how these can trigger. And I'm not sure if in the end that was to benefit of Ukraine or not, but it's an interesting question to ask.
What do you think about a future conflict elsewhere, either again in Europe, the Middle East, or maybe China? What are some lessons from what you just spoke about with Putin and then that buildup?
That's a great question. We
Thank
know, we know, and I've interviewed and talked to Ukrainians in Taiwan who are there helping the Taiwanese with their forces learn lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war. And how are they helping stand up a more capable defensive force? And you mentioned the lack of civil society, or someone mentioned, maybe it was Maria, the lack of civil society, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And a guy by the name of Enoch Wu in Taiwan, who's former SOF, is working very hard at building up civil resilience and civil society that can stand and fight at that level, in addition and in accord with Taiwan's military forces. But the PRC military, the CCP's military, the PLA, and the PLA Navy and Air Force, and their SOF are formidable in terms of numbers and apparent capability, but we don't know because they're untested. So are they willing to go to war with this untested force to retake Taiwan? But it's a lesson that they are definitely seeking to draw from. And their interactions with Russia are in line with that, and their interactions with Ukraine are in line with that.
So I want to go back to a point that Maria made, that we're in the same Cold War, in a sense. We just had a short pause. But one of the big differences you see between the Cold War and the 30 years post-Cold War is that during the Cold War, you have some Russian military action in Europe. The 1956 revolution in Hungary, you have the Prague Spring, 1968, obviously in Czechoslovakia. But after the Cold War, we actually see, if it is the same Cold War, then Russia's getting extremely aggressive, because obviously you have the wars in Chechnya, but you also have the 2008 invasion of Georgia, relatively small conflict, 2014 Ukraine, obviously, and then now this large-scale conventional war. So what changed so drastically from the Soviet Union, which, if you look at a map of the Soviet Union and Russia today, Soviet Union was absolutely massive, larger population, larger military, but they did not see the need to do, or they did not see an opportunity, perhaps, to do a conventional war in Europe. Why has Russia changed? And why is this part of the Cold War, if it's a continuation, been different?
I actually, thank you for the question. I don't necessarily see a lot of difference. It's the same Brezhnev doctrine, if you will, that applies to the post-Soviet space. And if you see at the Russian hostile actions, they don't necessarily start with Putin. Already back in 1990s, right after the end of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of efforts to get under control countries like Georgia, Armenia, even the Baltics. Yeltsin was highly reluctant to withdraw the troops from the Baltics. That was one of the main victories, actually, of the West. But other than that, all of the post-Soviet space, again, except Azerbaijan, everywhere the Soviet Union kept the military, its troops deployed and participated as a quote-unquote peacekeeper in many of the conflict across the regions, in some ways even provoked them since the early 1990s. So in that sense, Putin directly inherits the same posture, except that Russia got more resources. And in my opinion, again, if you read Putin, even before he comes to power, what he said about the West, what he said about Ukraine right after he comes to power in early 2000s, he says we have to do something about Ukraine, otherwise we're going to lose it. All of that is the effort to apply the same approach as Brezhnev did towards the countries of the Warsaw Pact. Putin applies it towards the countries of the former Soviet countries, again, except the Baltics, probably, so far. We have seen a lot of consistency with the early post-Soviet Russia under Yeltsin and Putin, subsequently, to try to take these territories under control. There's a growing assertiveness. There is no change of goals. The growing assertiveness, I would argue, is associated to more resources in Russia's disposal. And this is where, again, I don't fully agree with Christopher. I don't believe, again, you can argue, yes, of course, early Putin was much more pro-Western, but Russia was much more weaker back then. The Gorbachev new thinking, lasting through Yeltsin and until early Putin, is a function of Russia's relative material weakness. What happens in 2007 is that the oil prices start to skyrocket, and Russia pays off the debt to the Paris to the Paris Club. So it's no longer dependent on the Western credits. And once you see that, in 2006 it happens, you see ultimate, like radical altering of the Putin's rhetoric and the posture. But that's not because he radically changed his views about the West. It's because he now had the resources to act on the beliefs that were there in the first place. And also, you shouldn't be expecting much from the former KGB colonel. They're brainwashed. He came of age at the peak of the Cold War under late Brezhnev early Andropov. They were socialized and brainwashed and selected there based on their extreme hostility towards the West. And this is the sort of things that, first of all, you don't commonly go into that sort of security agency unless you already have certain leanings in that direction. And then, of course, you don't just lose these beliefs if the circumstances change. So you interpret everything through these lenses, and I think it's quite consistent what we've seen. So in that sense, I don't see radical change with Brezhnev, except that Russia is now much smaller, so it has to moderate its ambition. Its ambition expands towards the former Soviet space, but not so far behind it, even if I have to say that appetite grows as you eat. And so we see that if Russia, for example, wins, there's no necessarily reasons why it wouldn't stop at Ukraine. We know based on Rusi reporting that they already had Moldova in their early plans when they were invading Ukraine in 2022. So they can go potentially beyond it, but so far they kept their ambition limited to the Soviet Union. So if there's any achievement of the West after the end of the Cold War, it's definitely pushing the infliction, like the line, the conflict further east. Now it's going through Ukraine, while previously it was going through Germany.
So many realist thinkers say the expansion of NATO is what pushed the Russians to, counterbalance, if you will, if you're going straight off the theory. So that you do not agree with that assessment?
No, I first of all track very carefully in a number of publications, including the book and making, the rhetoric associated to NATO expansion, and often it's forgotten that Russia, including Putin himself and many Russian elite members, until 2007 made the point that Russia should join NATO. Also, after the 2002-2004 expansion of NATO, Putin actually was fine. He said it on several occasions that as long as there's no nuclear missiles deployed on the Baltic countries, he was fine with it. He's on record. It's not NATO per se. It's Russia's role in European security, and again the fact that NATO is part of the broader issues with the West altogether that they're after. So NATO is just part of the story where the major problem has to do with the West is expanding into the territories that are quote unquote historically Russian or /Soviet. If you remember 2014, for example, the issue was not NATO expansion. In fact, at the time Ukraine has constitutional ban on potentially joining NATO. It was about the European Union, and the European Union in that sense is still the same West occupying, in the Russian view, expanding to the territories that are theirs. And so I think that by over-focusing on the NATO and its role, we actually tend to often throw away the baby with the water, unfortunately.
Chris, comment?
So obviously, Marie and I disagree on this one point, that the growing assertiveness is a function of Putin's power and what's at his disposal based on economic wealth and materiel. I disagree. I think there was a cognitive shift on behalf of Putin, and I think it was partly NATO expansion, but it was also growing U.S. involvement around the world, from the wars in Afghanistan and the wars in Iraq, and our involvement in other parts of the world, and this led to a belligerent posture that was perceived by Putin that came to a head, I think, in 2007, and then led to not just the Estonia situation with the Bronze Knights cyber attack, but in 2008 with the small-scale operation or relatively small-scale operation in Georgia in August of 2008, but that there was an evolution in his thinking. And to back that up, I think when Putin went to law school in Leningrad, State University that became St. Petersburg State University while he's there, and studied under Anatoly Sobchak, and then was mentored by Anatoly Sobchak, who I believe was a Democrat, and fit the bill as a Democrat. That he came on his first trip to the United States. Putin at this time. That's a very different Putin than the 2007 Munich Security Conference speech Putin. Is he still that KGB colonel? Yes. But I think there was an opportunity for him, and he entertained other thoughts during the early 2000s. But that's my read.
Well, unfortunately, Putin couldn't be here. Or no, not unfortunately, but we have yet
You
to
think
talk.
he'll be honest?
Sorry.
He'll tell the truth?
Yeah. Would he tell the truth?
Yeah.
Even in the thing about actors on the international stage is a concept called trusted agent. So can you actually trust what they say? So even if Putin was here and he was telling us, could we actually trust what he said? So how do we know what's going into the decision makers of world leaders? And what we're getting is two different views from our two panelists here. And so how do you apply that concept to Xi Jinping or another leader to understand what's in their calculus for decision making? Is it their background? Is it their training? Is it how they see the world? Are they playing checkers instead of chess? So it makes foreign policy, as they say, this backbreaking burden. You have to figure out what's in that decision making calculus of the adversary you're facing. And it's not going to be the same for the Russians or the Chinese or the Hamas or the Iranians. You have to take each as an individual case and you have to look into it. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of intelligence. And you have to maintain an open mind. What worked in Afghanistan in 2005 might not work in Iraq in 2008. You see Samuel Huntington notes that you could be a prisoner of your own experience and your own education in a sense, because you've learned something here, you just apply it to every case that even seems similar. So we have to be wary of that as we look at the lessons learned for this conflict as well. There are lessons to be learned, but most lessons are conceptual, not specific, if that makes sense. And I think we've hit this point considerably. So let's go into the war. So the war was not deterred, obviously. Putin was not deterred. He invades in 2022. Now, as the war has gone on for the past 3 years, what are some lessons we've learned economically, as both the Ukrainians, the Russians, as well as the Europeans and Americans have drummed up manufacturing? Just last year, President Zelensky announced that Ukraine will be producing roughly 4 million drones per year, massive increase of drones, for example. So what does this mean for military production? What does it mean for economic economies at scale, whether if it's war or those supporting the war, the arsenals of either democracy or the what do you call it, the axis of evil? So these of evil, yep. So these two different war footings for the economies, and then lastly, just looking at the idea of a conventional war. Obviously, the Russians weren't really ready for a large-scale conventional conflict. The Europeans and the Americans, when it comes to production, were definitely not thinking about thousands of 155 artillery rounds per day. It's very hard to maintain that production unless you're on a war footing. So what are those lessons learned as we look? The war is now started. What are countries, the U.S., the West, Ukraine, Russia, and Russia's partners looking at? Maria?
Yes, thank you very much. So the main takeaway is, again, somewhat of a cliche, that Russia is never as strong as we fear, but never as weak as we hope. That is definitely true in this war, meaning that indeed it was not deterrable in the hindsight, but it very much is containable for the West. And that is something I think that we should factor in going forward. In fact, full disclosure, at CSIS, we have come up with the whole idea of the new containment of Russia, although a lot depends on the role of China and the United States in this story. Sanctions are working. In fact, they're cutting down the Russian oil revenues, although perhaps could do better. At this point, Russia is receiving 20% of oil revenues below what it would have potentially received without sanctions. There was also complicated access to all sorts of technologies, even if export controls are circumvented left and right. At the very least, the access to those technologies that Russia needs, in dual-use components, has become far more expensive, even if China is substituting for major bulks of many of the dual-use technologies that Russia needs. But at the same time, At the same time, Russia is able to fight the war at this pace for quite some time. And this is perhaps the argument that this administration has used vis-a-vis Ukraine, because Russia still has men to recruit and still has resources to build. When it comes to the war more broadly, again, it's true that we're always getting ready to the past wars. And the war, in a lot of ways, was not at all as we anticipated it would be at the start. A lot of analysts are flagging that a lot of parallels this war has is the First World War, with tremendous attrition, with the front line not really moving as much, where the drones, one of the major kind of breakthrough innovations in this war, have made the front line so transparent that a lot of soldiers essentially get instantly killed. Many of the captured Russian soldiers report that they were yet to meet a single Ukrainian soldier on the front line. It's all about the drones. And this transparency have made the front line very hard to shift, just because every side is quite aware of the behavior of the actions on the other side. The question is to what extent these lessons are applicable to future wars. If China, for example, was to attack Taiwan, many things would probably be different. It's a very different setting. But nonetheless, clearly the future technologies, especially the drone industry, the applications are quite useful, and the US military in particular has been learning a lot based on the application of drones in Ukraine.
Speaking about the last point with China and Taiwan, the problem with contested and clandestine logistics is going to be huge in any kind of conflict between China trying to reunify with Taiwan and the United States trying to intervene. I personally don't think that the present administration has an appetite for intervening. With the Trump administration transactional approach to foreign policy, I think that, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that if there is an attack against Taiwan, that the United States will largely sit it out. And the fact that the Chinese have been watching the Ukraine conflict, or watching a diminishment of U.S. support to Ukraine after 3 years, just bolsters their thinking that if there is U.S. intervention, if there is U.S. involvement in supporting Taiwan, it's just watch your watch, and it'll be a matter of time before they back off. And it's a much different conflict, with trying to get that logistics line through sea lines communication over to Taiwan is a much harder operation than what's going on in Europe with pre-positioned forces in Eastern Europe. So like I said, I'll go put myself out on a ledge here and say, hey, I don't know if the Trump administration is prepared to defend Taiwan, and whether or not they should, that's a whole other question, based on geopolitical stability and other questions. But I think it's certainly something that falls into the Xi Jinping calculus, as you were mentioned, which is something we can't get into Xi Jinping's head. We can read everything he says, we can read analyses, but to actually get in his head and find out what is he thinking, even if he were here, right? We can't do that.
Yeah, and that's it, goes that trusted actor concept. Some other lessons we can take away is the incremental approach that the war ended up playing out, which is part of the reason why we ended up with such a stalemate. Putin was possibly anticipating a fait accompli, a very quick operation, topples the government, puts in a pro-Russian leader, and then maybe annexes some of the eastern territories, but for the most part, pretty quick. And part of that design is that the quicker that you can do the operation, the less time for the West to mobilize support and provide aid. Aid also has to get there, so you just have transit time, but you also have the political debate that has to take place. So if you can complete an operation relatively quickly, you're likely to avoid the interference of other powers. We saw this in 2014. Crimea fell pretty much without firing a shot, and everyone just kind of accepted it as is. There wasn't that much pushback, some sanctions, But again, if you can do it quickly, you can make it happen. So that might be one lesson the Chinese are looking at. If they do try to go for Taiwan, how do we take it rapidly? But one of the lessons we've learned from history as well is that water has great stopping power. The English Channel has stopped Napoleonic armies from hitting the British, as well as German armies 130 years later. The English Channel at the shortest point is only about 20 miles. The Strait of Taiwan is about 100. So good stopping power there, although technology is quickly bridging that gap.
But we would have to bring from farther than that
Yes.
to get our support to the islands.
Right. Yeah. So it would be difficult to ensure deterrence. But the incremental approach to the war, once it got started in 2022, is you see the Ukrainians actually do not necessarily mass mobilize. They start their conscription at age 27, and then 2 years later bump it down to 25. But unlike even World War II, where most countries immediately went to 18 and mass mobilized all their adult, war age males, the Ukrainians and Russians, neither one did. So although it's a conventional conflict, it was a measured conventional conflict. And in some ways, that led to the stagnation we have at the front because neither side could mass the significant offensive forces, whether it be infantry, tanks, artillery, to have a major breakthrough because they're slowly battling the domestic front, the domestic politics front, as well as their own ambition to not entail or drag in most of the population into the conflict. So you see the Russians start the war, they lose the initial phase one portion, if you will, and then they activate 300,000 reservists. That's still not enough to break through. Then they start looking at prisons, they start looking at contractors, Wagner Group, and now we're at North Koreans and such. So in a sense, if you look going back to Clausewitz, if you look at just massing forces towards the beginning, they might have just done better to activate those reserves right at the beginning. If let's say they wanted to ensure a victory, the U.S. has operated off this principle of the Weinberger doctrine in the 1980s, leading into the Powell Doctrine. If you are going to use military force, use overwhelming military force, even if you think it's going to be an easy one. If you say you have to use overwhelming military force, and that's certainly a lesson that we learned here from obviously. Again, Russian imperfect information, as well as the Ukrainians' will to fight, which is, I heard General McKenzie say many times, it's hard to calculate the will to fight. You just don't know what that's going to be until it happens. So let's look at some of the other questions here from the audience, and I'll combine a few of these. But what are some lessons we see that would actually deter China from the conflict? Is it just a bunch of drones? We've heard a number of officials say that they could turn the U.S. officials say they could turn the Taiwan Straits into a drone hellscape. So is drones enough to deter a Chinese attack based off of what we've seen Putin has done in the post-Cold War era, as well as other conflicts? Maria?
I'm not a China expert, so that would be perhaps countered by colleagues. But one particular issue where many of the Western expectations about Russia turned out to be misguided was about the ability of the economic interdependence of Russia and the West to deter Russia, meaning that it was expected through the liberal international relations theories that Russia's trade with the West will somehow make it less hostile. The irony is that Putin also was thinking along the same lines, and he thought Europe will be limited in its ability to counter Russia's aggression for the same reason, because it's so dependent on the gas. Remember the attempted gas blackmail, as well as oil. The irony is that both sides ended up being wrong, and at this point, liberal theories, unfortunately, did not end up being very predicting the future. I wonder if maybe they'll do better in case of China, just because the U.S.-China trade is much more serious. There's definitely much more interconnectedness between China and the United States, and China's economy is not doing so well at the moment. In Russia, I am quite convinced that you can trace Russia's assertiveness directly correlated to its, the Kremlin's perception of its own material abundance, wealth at its disposal. And you can definitely track Russia's behavior in line with petro-aggression theory. So the higher the oil prices, the higher their revenues, the more aggressive they become. To an extent, you see that in China as well, and more recently, as the economic situation in China has worsened, you've seen China also becoming like scaling down on the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. So maybe the economic leverage will become more instrumental in case of China. That is definitely something for the United States to explore, but it clearly did not deliver as well as the West has hoped in case of Russia.
Chris.
I'm still thinking. In terms of the drone hellscape, I think that drones will be employed if there is a war to a great extent, and civilians will be employing drones as well. I think that the civilian population, with a kind of total defense situation, is what is on the plans for a Taiwan defensive set of maneuvers. But the question really is, will China make the move? Will the PRC attempt to take and conduct reunification, as they call it? And I think that calculus is tied in directly with the Trump administration's wording and verbiage and their statements that they're going to come out with regarding the island and the strait. So it's something we need to watch. I think the Trump administration will be clear on what they expect. And I'm not sure, it's interesting with Maria's point about the economic integration levels between China and the United States, because that's a liberal international relations theory argument. But she is using a realist power theory to explain the rise of Putin's bellicose nature. I wonder if I'm a realist. My advisor was John Mearsheimer's student, so I drank the Kool-Aid, if you will, and I think it's about power, but it's also about power perception. And I think you were getting at that, and how China perceives the likely use of U.S. power in a Taiwan invasion, I think, is the critical variable that we need to understand. And it's yet to be manifested, and it will. And when it is, it will give this clear signal one way or the other to Xi Jinping and the PLA leadership.
And it seems to come back to that point about messaging for the leaders, right? The decision makers are going to make the decision off, again, imperfect information. They're looking for the possible adversaries to send them a clear signal or message on what they're going to do, and they can try to anticipate that. And if they anticipate weakness using a realist perspective, then that deterrence will fail and they will act because they're anticipating that based off of the signals that they're getting from the adversary's leaders, whether that's we will act, we will not, or we're ambiguous, which could actually lead to even worse outcomes when it's not clear what's going on. But again, you also might not want to tell your possible adversaries what your plans are. For the economic countries being entwined economically, we've seen this theory play out multiple times. Before World War I, there was a lot of literature about how the countries are so economically intertwined. We can't go to war. We can't afford it. Or it'd have to be a very short war. And they were proven drastically wrong in World War I. And that obviously has continued to play out. Maybe if they would have had a conference like this after World War I, we could have avoided some of those issues. But luckily, we're here today to solve it for the next one. So as we look obviously at NATO expansion, which a realist would say is part of the reason for, as we discussed, that power play, NATO's expanding, it's a threat to Russia. What role does NATO play now as Finland and Sweden have joined the alliance? NATO is now 32 countries. It's the largest alliance, most powerful alliance in history. It's often quoted. It's certainly one of the longest. It's certainly one of the largest in the forms of multinational capabilities. But the U.S. is still the leader. So what role does NATO play now as the war continues, but also there could be an end in sight?
In my opinion, the fact that Sweden and Finland joining NATO did not really provoke any radical response on the side of Russia, just another manifestation that NATO is secondary in the Russians' viewpoint and calculus, as opposed to its spheres of interest and control over the countries that it perceives to be like within its spheres of interest. Sweden and Finland were perceived by the Kremlin as sort of having been lost long before they joined NATO. So NATO, again, does not seem to me like the major part of the story of what's going on. It's really about Russia's new imperial revanchism, first and foremost. Definitely the war sort of, and in general, Putin has done, his actions have done a lot to revive NATO. It's no longer brain dead, to cite President Macron of France, and clearly has been united. But of course, the big if right now is the role of the United States. If the United States withdraws, like abandons NATO or like limits its commitment to NATO, which is likely to happen against the backdrop of everything that's going on, we're going to see a very different situation. So I think at this particular moment, we are sort of at the cross section where it's very hard to say what sort of role NATO will play, but it's very likely that if NATO is further weakened, it sort of incentivizes Putin to go further. Because as I mentioned before, post-Soviet Russia does not go after a stronger enemy. It goes after the weaker side consistently, after the countries neighboring Russia in the post-Soviet space. But the problem how Putin perceives NATO. Does it see NATO as a stronger side party, as it probably does right now? Or does it see NATO as a weakened party, especially without the United States in it? That may really radically alter his calculus. I would also add one more quick point to our previous discussion about China and lessons learned. I will add that Putin has fought at least 5 wars since the start of his rule, and has arguably had a lot of experience. Yet he badly miscalculated at the start of the war in Ukraine, as we have discussed. China hasn't fought a lot of wars, right, since 1970s, at the very least on the land. So we wonder to what extent the lack of experience will again determine probably again a lot of at least the regional mistakes that will be made on the side of China.
I agree with a lot of what Maria said. That she kind of took it right out of my mouth. So that's good. I'll just add on to it a few things. One is where she left off with the Trump administration's posture towards NATO and its position. This remains to be seen more clearly, but the transactional approach that the Trump administration's taking towards NATO members is, I think, dangerous, especially for deterrence effects. Telling states that, well, if you don't have 2% or even higher or 3%, we might not be there when the time comes. That's dangerous, because that means that the United States is not 100% committed to its allies, its quote-unquote allies. And that, I think, can just lead to greater bellicose behavior on the part of Putin. And then when it comes to Asia, there is no NATO. It's a hub-and-spoke security relationship of bilats. And these bilateral relationships are intermixed and intermingled, but not having a NATO, I think, has served the United States well so far, but it won't leave anything in the void if the United States decides on its own to not get involved in the Taiwan conflict. And getting back to the European continent, if the United States further backs away from NATO, it's going to be up to Europe and Canada to go on their own in supporting Ukraine against Russia. And that it remains to be seen what that'll look like and how effective that will be. And it remains to be seen whether or not we will indeed back away from the NATO organization, North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Well, what does that mean? Let's take a look at some other conflicts and taking lessons out of the Ukraine conflict. What does that mean for other conflicts around the world, whether we're looking at Gaza or, again, the Middle East in general, obviously with the recent changeover in Syria? or even on the African continent? What do you think?
Well, first of all, the war in Ukraine that Putin started in 2022 has been highly destabilizing for the world. We have seen 2024, based on the Global Peace Index, being the most conflict-prone, the year with most conflicts since the end of the Second World War, which tells you something about the international environment in which we find ourselves in. The less the West is capable of visibly capable of containing Russia in Ukraine, the more incentives it has been sending out to other hostile actors to also try and bite off pieces of neighboring states and revise the territories. A lot of ancient grievances have suddenly resurged. And I do believe that the liberal international order is in danger as to the extent that you can speak right now of it still existing. At this point, I think it's in question. So it definitely has empowered a lot of hostile actors. It shaped this axis of upheaval. And unfortunately, even until this moment, we haven't been able to quite successfully contain Russia to the extent we have been able to. And I started my presentation with it, but not sufficiently. I think we are, with everything that's going on right now and potential US withdrawal of its help to Ukraine, we are going to find ourselves even far more dangerous world and more destabilization will follow. There are, of course, like deviations from the track. Iran has been, for example, quite significantly weakened by Israeli action. So Iran right now can probably be seen as a weaker party, but it will possibly grow back. A lot will depend on the situation with the oil prices. Many of these hostile actors are feeding off the oil revenues. And in general, the future dynamic of the oil market is quite favorable for the West. This year in particular, it's forecasted that there will be more oil supply than demand, partly because of the relative economic weakening of China. As a result, potentially there will be fewer oil revenues available to countries like Russia and Iran. But again, all of that is highly conditioned on the West unity and ability to sustain very consistent policies in that regard. At this particular moment, it's hard to confidently say that is the case.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, really. I think the only thing I would say is it's not just oil prices, but it's the liquidity and movability of the wealth generating variable. So diamonds, for instance, are much more mobile than oil. You have to have total control of a country really to get oil out and get it into international markets, as opposed to something like diamonds or rare earth minerals, which can be more valuable in smaller quantities. So I think that when we're looking to Africa or other places, we need to think not just in terms of raw numbers and the flow of oil, but into the type of economic trade that they're engaging in. And CT is still around. We're still dealing with global terrorism. It's a part of strategic competition. It's a part of counterterrorism is a part of irregular warfare, and it's alive and well. And we need to be thinking about that and not just saying that the global war on terror is over and therefore we've killed all the terrorists. That's the farthest thing from the truth. We need to be thinking about CT operations and how we're going to continue to do those through SOF and through conventional forces when they spill over into large-scale combat operations.
Well, with all that in mind, as we come up towards the end of our time, a last overarching question before we do closing statements is what does a win look like? Is if you can look at from the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, and even from the West, if those are three different ideas of what a possible win or end of the war can look like. And then what does that mean for lessons going forward should that come about, from those different perspectives?
I'd say there are two ways for Ukraine, given the current situation, to win. By the way, the Biden administration strategically did not define what victory meant, which was, again, to define any kind of situation on the ground, short of Ukraine complete surrender to Russia, as a victory, which is one of the reasons why we got where we are, because there was never any strategy, consistent strategy as to how to make Ukraine win, despite the strategy was not completely unfeasible. So the given the current situation on the ground, what are realistic scenarios? First of all, the scenario that I started with is the possibility of a stalemate. If the situation doesn't radically change, if there is a consistent flow of Western aid to Ukraine, the stalemate is achievable, and after a while, it's possible that Russian unity and resilience will begin to crack. As I mentioned, they, for example, are halfway through all the available stocks of tanks and other types of the Soviet stockpiles at their disposal. And it's also clear that they've run for the better stuff first. So whatever they have left is not very good quality. So they can pull this off for some time, but eventually it's clear that they have accumulated economic problems and whatnot. It's possible to get Russia in the situation, especially if sanctions are reinforced and there are there's radical reduction in the oil revenues. In particular, this is Russia's Achilles heel. There is a way to push Russia into a much more reconciliatory mood, where it's not yet. That is, however, a big if, because as we know, as we speak right now, Western aid is the big question. So it's either a stalemate or a possibility for Russia to get a more reconciliatory position. Again, none of that is very likely given the situation. It's much more likely right now that we're going to have some sort of quick rushed peace, which will only empower the Kremlin, reconfirm Putin's priors that the West is not resilient, is not united, and make him reattack in a couple of years, make him reconstitute what was lost in a couple of years. There are a lot of security agencies, analysts predicting that he is very much able to do that in a few years, which will be highly problematic for the West. But the big moving variable apart from the Western aid is also China. It's also true that the West is unable at the moment to fight the war in two fronts. And it's likely that many of the Trump administration actions vis-a-vis Ukraine are motivated with the perception of the imminent clash with China that's coming. We have seen many of the members of the incoming administration making the point that the war in Ukraine has been very problematic for the stocks in the Indo-Pacific. Some of the weapons that have been strategically deployed in that direction have been used instead in Ukraine, and essentially it was a pure waste. Russia is not a conventional threat, but China very much is. So if China is added to the mix, then it becomes much more problematic, because even if the settlement, so it's understandable that they want to just forget about Ukraine and refocus on China, but if China attacks and there is some sort of freeze in Ukraine, what is to stop Putin to synchronize the attack against either Ukraine or even NATO together with China? And this is potentially the most serious and problematic scenario. I do not think at the time we are ready for the challenge that it will represent. The United States is not ready, and definitely Europe is not ready. Europe has not done enough to sustain its own security. In that sense, there is a lot of logic in what the Trump administration is doing, but it's not so much about the goals, it's more about how that is being done that is more problematic, I'd argue.
Chris, quickly.
I think a stalemate would be a victory for Putin. He would gain territories that he did not have before, and he could say that that was his objective all along, and that he's never come out and said other than defascification and demilitarization and not joining NATO. You know, what truly land did he want to gain from his large scale combat operations? And if he comes away with the territories he's acquired, and he's asking at the negotiating table for the rest of those oblasts, which he doesn't even hold with force, that would be a win. So a stalemate is a win, and a win is a win. So if Ukraine would have to do the impossible and regain everything for it to be a Ukrainian victory. But then if you flip it around, and if Ukraine can hold Kyiv and Zelensky can stay in power, then that's also kind of a win for Ukraine. So it's based on the individual perspective of the leaderships in each capital. For the United States, I don't know what a U.S. win looks like, but I think it's all based on perspective. I mean, after the Gulf War, we in 91, we, showed Saddam Hussein what we could do militarily, and it was amazing. And the Chinese are still learning lessons from it as they study it in their war colleges. But we were pretty surprised when Saddam came out and said he won, because he was still in power. He wasn't removed from power. So as far as he was concerned, it was a victory. So the same thing for these territories that are being held by Russian forces. If they can hold those forces at the end of the negotiating table, and as Maria pointed out, give him time to reconstitute his forces, it's just an operational pause. And it's an exercise in strategic patience for when he's going to try to go again and go somewhere else.
Right. Well, and one of the things we've, again, looking at history up till this conflict is post-conflict, let's say there is a ceasefire and there are peacekeeping forces, we should anticipate, and the military-industrial complex in the sense of manufacturing munitions and also the military arm of the Europeans that would likely be doing the peacekeeping force, as anticipating decades-long peacekeeping forces. If you need examples, you could obviously look at the Korean Peninsula, where the U.S. has been there. That's what deterrence has to look like, is troops on the ground. You have these, whether triple R forces, peacekeeping forces, Cyprus, or going back to the Cold War example, 40 years of hundreds of thousands of troops in West Germany was what it took to deter the Soviets, or at least that's what the containment strategy the U.S. was putting forth then. So if this war ends, it doesn't just end like that. The militaries don't just get to go home. There's going to be a stand-up and a manning of either a DMZ or some sort of line of contact. And it might even look similar to the situation after 2014, where you had a line of contact in the Donbass and the Ukrainians are cycling forces through. Because remember, holding a line requires three times the force. You have one force on the line, one force training, and one force recuperating from being on the line. So you need a lot of personnel and equipment to be able to cycle through that type of military operation. And you might be doing it for decades, which again is not inconceivable. So something that leaders in industry will have to look at. So with our last moments, 1 minute wrap up, the big three takeaways. One minute. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Chris,
I'm ready.
Hit it.
Yeah, just 1 minute. U.S. does not have an appetite for another long-term overseas engagement. The Russians don't look at negotiations as negotiations, but opportunities for operational pause. And we don't live in a bubble, and China's watching.
Interesting. Maria?
I think Ukraine, in a lot of ways, has already won for the reasons that I have emphasized. Yes, it may not be able to recover all of the territories that have been occupied by Russia, but it did preserve the sovereignty and the maximalist goals of Putin, unlikely to be achieved no matter what. Second, even if there is a freeze of the war, it's not going to end. It's very clear. Putin is going to reconstitute and reattack. There is no security guarantees for Ukraine, and even if there are some peacekeepers, they're going to be only deployed within a very limited area, most likely. Russia will still be able to continue, for example, highly detrimental attacks on Ukraine energy infrastructure and whatnot. This is the main problem. The war has no ending, as we see right now. A lot of our assumptions about Russia, about the Western behavior has been misguided, proved wrong for the war, and hopefully we'll do better next time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As we said, all of our comments were our own, and thank you everyone for Business's first panel.